Good morning, I am Connor Riffle, the Director of Cities and Product Innovation at CDP. I'm delighted to be the moderator for today's session on measurement and planning. I'm particularly delighted to moderate this particular session because you today are going to hear about some incredible efforts by 5 world-class cities on what they are doing to measure, plan, and report on their climate work. Those cities are Salaam, Johannesburg, Mexico City, Boston, and Vancouver. So I promise you, you're in for a treat. I'm gonna have a few short remarks in a minute, but first, I'm very pleased to welcome a very special presentation from one of the newest members of C40, Salaam. So let me now welcome to the stage the Honorable Mayor of Salaam, Dr. Didas Massaburi.
High-level dignitaries, summit delegates, participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. I'm Didas Massaburi. I'm the mayor of the city of Salaam, and the city is made up of 3 municipalities. So there are 3 municipalities within the city. So the city is planning in the regional strategies. To start with my presentation today, I would like, first of all, to ask you individually, why are you here? I don't know how will you respond about this question, but we need to take a minute to think about this question. Very important, that why are you here in the summit of C40? I hope some of you would give similar responses, but all of you would accept the fact that you came to attend the C40 Mayors Summit. But all in all, every person would give a different response regarding the objectives she or he want to achieve after the summit, varying from technical to financial solutions. I personally came to the C40 Mayors Summit for barrier of ignorance. That is to get rid of ignorance on counting. I really don't know how to count, and I can swear about that one. It's very difficult. If I ask you, some of you will say that they know how to count, but maybe you don't know the unit of measure when you are counting. If I say I'm ignorant in this, I don't know how many will join me about that. But I hope nobody will join, because nobody would like to be called an ignorant person. But it might happen that most of us here don't know how to count the impact of climate change in their cities. And I want to ask you, is this not ignorance? Throughout my past life, until over the recent past, after I became the Lord Mayor of the city of Salaam, I was made to understand and believe that the topmost enemies of development were ignorance, poverty, and poor health. These were the dreams of the father of nation of Tanzania, the late Mwalimu Nyerere, who was the first president. He normally said that we have 3 enemies: ignorance, poverty, and poor health. But now I have learned that poor health and poverty are only the symptoms. The core problem is the marriage that exists between the ignorance and climate change. The couple is the parents of the poverty and poor health, which now is enhancing the shortage and scarcity of water, energy, and food nexus, which is a result of climate change impact. I hope we all know that while the demand of water, energy, and food in our city is increasing due to increasing urbanization, but the supply of the same is decreasing at a very high speed due to ignorance on better strategies to address the climate change challenges. I also hope that we know that a person who can't count is typically ignorant. This is because any literacy process normally starts by counting, knowing numbers used for measurement. As a procurement professional, I believe that any procurement is based on quantities. If you can't quantify the items that you want to procure, you can't determine the price, and therefore there is no existence of procurement itself, because you can't pay. I therefore understand that in order to fight the impact of climate change, we need to gather data which are normally quantitative or qualitative in nature. However, in both cases, these data must be measured to establish the level of effort needed to address the challenges. But in addition, that level itself, the level of effort needed, also needs to be measured again. Otherwise, we can't plan, monitor, and evaluate the results of the efforts we put into the process. This implies that we cannot manage any process without measuring the inputs and outputs of the process itself. This session is therefore very important because it will improve our ability to measure the impacts of climate change and share experiences on how to measure, and also to be able to report out the status and the pace of sustainable development in our cities. In Dar es Salaam, we have experiences. We have already identified the importance of C40 and decided to join the team of winners. That's why I'm here. We are currently implementing various projects after measurement, but I'm not sure whether we measured them in the right way. That's why I would ask the director there to assist me to see how we can better improve our plans. Right now, we are implementing the BRT project, the community infrastructure upgrading project, which is trying to remove the unsettlement, the slum areas, to improve the livelihood and adapt to the climate change. We are also implementing the solid waste system aiming at reduction of greenhouse gases emission through composting and energy generation, sustainable urban planning, and recently we have introduced the smart area idea and safety city project in Dar es Salaam. I would conclude by urging African cities to join the winners team, the C40. The fight against climate change impact needs combined efforts from all cities around the world, especially megacities. Now I'll give you a message, two messages. One is that nobody is as clever as everybody. And the second message I want you to go with during this session is that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think C40 has a new tagline, Team of Winners. I just have a few very short remarks to kick us off. Following from yesterday's plenary session, in which you saw the results from C40's great report on climate action in megacities, I am very excited that C40 has launched and staffed a new initiative on measurement and planning. So this initiative has three parts. The first part is launching a global standard for measuring greenhouse gas emissions, known as the Global Protocol for Community Scale GHG Emissions. And this supports cities with a clear and robust methodology to facilitate benchmarking among cities. So this is a very important effort, and I'm very glad that C40 is leading on that. The second part of the Measurement and Planning Network is to support cities with data collection and reporting their emissions, which is also a very important piece of the puzzle. And then the final part is that C40 is working with cities to develop climate action plans and monitoring practices. So this is a really fantastic initiative, and I'm delighted to congratulate C40 on the launch of it, and I encourage all of you to check it out and to become members of the initiative. I also want to mention the C40 Exchange, which has just launched. The exchange is a web interchange where cities can exchange best practices, access further information about about this and other initiatives, and also talk to other cities and exchange ideas. So if you haven't logged into the exchange yet, I encourage you to do it. There's a lot of great information there, and it's really a wonderfully valuable resource for C40 cities. And then the last thing I want to say is that today we're discussing measurement and planning, and for C40 cities, that means reporting to CDP every year. The reporting period for CDP for 2014 is opening today for C40 cities. You and your staff will receive your annual email with directions on how to get started, and the deadline for responding this year is the 28th of March. And we have a special incentive for cities this year, thanks to our partners at AECOM. There are many exciting reasons for participating in CDP, but I want to mention one in particular. Cities that score well on CDP this year are receiving a wonderful personalized copy of their response, nicely bound and formatted. This has been created by our partners at AECOM, and we're doing this for the cities that do the best on the CDP response. So a little further inducement for cities to get started early and to do a good job on their CDP response. Now, I'm delighted to welcome for our first presentation of the day on measurement and planning, the city manager for the city of Johannesburg, Trevor Fowler.
Thank you, Connor. Good morning, everyone, mayors, city managers, officials of various cities. First of all, let me say as a Joburger, welcome to the city of Joburg. And we've really enjoyed the last 2 days with you. And we hope that the conclusion today will not only give you further opportunities to advance our mitigation and our measures to address climate change, but also that you'll remember Joburg and come back next time you have a free moment. Thank you. Let me turn to our presentation. Joburg did a gas emissions profile of the city, and we undertook that because what we wanted to do was to really understand what the profile of those emissions are in the city. But in doing so, I'd really want to take you through the presentation. Now I've got to figure out how to manage this thing. Right. So we'll go through the national policy, legislative framework, South Africa's response to mitigation, Johannesburg's program, our GPC inventory, overview of the reporting framework, and our greenhouse gases per sector. Our national framework is really covered in the legislation that is there, and I won't go through the legislation, but essentially to say it provides a framework for us to look at, first of all, the framework on increasing access to affordable energy services. One of the key problems we face is that nationally, if people don't have access to electricity, there are other impacts which have an impact on the environment. So people will cut down trees for wood, etc. So it's a very important measure. In Johannesburg itself, electrification meant that in the winter, the townships were no longer smoke-filled, and one of the consequences of that was that 50% of children born in Johannesburg suffered, it's declining now, suffer from asthma and other lung-related diseases. It also covers our energy policy, our climate change response, which I'll address, our energy efficiency strategy, long-term mitigation measures, and of course we've put together an integrated resource plan which really provides the map towards future energy landscape for South Africa and our energy infrastructure and policy development. We've also developed a carbon tax policy paper which is really to look at large-scale capital projects, minimize the need for retrofitting, so that we can try to encourage people to build and undertake efforts which are less have less impact from a carbon point of view. The next slide really shows what our plan is nationally, that our greenhouse gases should stop growing by 2025, the end of reaching a plateau by 2030-35, and reducing it somewhere by 2050-60. We're committed to greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 34% by 2020 and 42% by 2025. That's our national framework. Let me go on to there we go. Our climate change program objective, it's one, to create synergy with the national government priorities, mitigation as an integral part of sustainable urban development, reducing the risk and vulnerability as a result of climate change, but also looking at adaptation and resilience as a strong focus. One of the key questions that developing countries face is, how do you ensure that you address the basic needs of people about access to basic services, addressing poverty, addressing food security, while also committing resources to your long-term objectives. And I'll show you the unique challenge that Joburg faces further on in our slides. Okay. This really indicates the way our inventory has been done. It was conducted with the C40 measurement and planning initiative in partnership with Siemens. We started in November 2013, and a 2007 baseline was established. And the C40 and Siemens will continue to assist the city in improving our data. And the report was completed in January. But it separates it into direct and indirect emissions, and I'll explain that a bit in a little more depth in the next slide. First of all, those are the direct emissions that come from the city, from residences, from commercial, from factories, cars, etc. Those are direct emissions. Then the indirect emissions are for Johannesburg and South Africa. It's electricity in particular, but there are other indirect emissions which are not in the city, and that's referred to as scope 2. And then we have this slide. It's got all kinds of graphics. That's the waste that's been measured. So all of those were measured and were then put together. The reporting framework is really covered by residential, commercial facilities, energy generation, industrial energy use, fugitive emissions, and those are then measured under direct and indirect. Then we've got the mobile units, such as on-road transportation, railways, waterborne navigation, aviation, etc. We've been able to measure aviation. I'll move on a bit faster. We've got solid waste as well. And let me move on to the real content. That indicates the volumes and the quantities, but it's much easier to explain it in the following slide. The following slide shows that South Africa's transport is relatively low relative to other cities, and largely attributable to that we just put in a new train and underground network. We also have a light rail system, but we have metro, a BRT, and we also have a metro bus, which is a feeder system into the BRT. The most area that is the largest really is the commercial and industrial, and then of course the residential is the next. But I think the next slide shows the most interesting part of this, is that if you look at electricity, it's around 38%. Let me back this up. There we go. Though electricity is 38%, it is almost 3/4 of the emissions. And consumption or by fuel is diesel and petrol make up a large percentage, but it only represents about 24%, and the remainder, jet aviation, is 4%. So it's very interesting for us as to how we address our climate change initiatives. If you look at London, we have London and Johannesburg. London has double the number of residences or households, but if you look at the footprint, the emissions for Johannesburg are almost the same as it is in London. And some of that relates to some of the efficiencies that are there, relate to use of gas, etc., for cooking in the interior. Transport emissions, 43% are from cars and bikes, 14% from mini taxis, 25% from HUVs, and 3% from buses. So buses represent a small quantity because we're still rolling out our mass transit system. It is not adequately rolled out, and we want to address that. So in summary, the data quality is a challenge for all cities. Some strong data around waste, electricity consumption, etc. But we need refinement around stationary fuels and transport. This first GPC is a starting point for us and an opportunity to improve data collection. There are no industrial process and product use included in the initial collection, and we'll do so in later stages. And we need to coordinate across a number of public and private sector organizations. We have a great opportunity as Johannesburg to seize, to use this and to develop strategies to address this. The South African companies have a fairly good track record on keeping records, and the growth in green buildings in Johannesburg is quite remarkable in the last few years. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Very interesting. And I'd like to now welcome to the stage Tanya Müller, the Secretary of Environment for Mexico City. Tanya, please.
Good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here today. Just a quick question. Have any of you been to Mexico City? Oh, several. Well, just to give a little bit of context. Okay, there we go. Mexico City's metropolitan area is the third largest urban agglomeration worldwide. We have a little bit over 22 million inhabitants. And obviously the demand for services, transportation is very large. And also the demand or the consumption of fuel energy. We have more than 2 million households, 65,000 industries, and more than 5 million vehicles. And each year, approximately 200,000 new vehicles are incorporated. Okay. So 60% of our energy consumption comes from the transport sector within the metropolitan area. There are more than 21 million trips that were done every day, and 12 million of those 21 occur in Mexico City. All these trips consume approximately 48 million liters of gasoline every day. 80% of our greenhouse emissions in Mexico City are due to the consumption of energy in the form of fossil fuels and electricity used in industry, commerce, and services. In 2012, Mexico City only generated more than 43 million tons of CO2, more than 2,000 tons of black carbon, among other emissions, and most of them came from the industry and transport sector. Regarding our inventories, since 1990s, our emission inventories include 8 criteria pollutants, 4 toxic air pollutants, and our greenhouse gases. And in 2002, the inventory for greenhouse gases was used to elaborate our climate action strategy, which then evolved to our climate action program 2008-2012. In June 2011, the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Sustainability Development Law was published, and which was followed by its regulation in 2012, and Mexico City was one of the first to have this regulation. The procedures that we use for inventory reports are prepared in accordance with the national and international methodologies. When we prepare our inventories, we make a review of all the latest scientific and technological knowledge for the best methodologies available for this specific sector, and it's reviewed by experts before its publication. We really believe that we need to have very accurate data, and that's why we have this we have it reviewed by external experts. The traceability of emission inventories is set under IPCC guidelines related to quality assurance and quality control to enhance transparency, consistency, comparability, and completeness. We're also reporting, we're reporting to international platforms. In 2012, Mexico City reported its green gas emissions to the Carbon Cities Climate Registry, and in 2013, we reported to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and of course, we will be reporting for 2014 again to CDP. Something we're also very excited about is that we're going to start working with New York City University School of Medicine to analyze samples of filters to determine sources of black carbon. And after the analysis, NYU will provide policy recommendations targeting specific sources to reduce black carbon. We believe that inventories and the reports are a fundamental tool in our decision-making process, and in the design and implementation of policies oriented to improve air quality in Mexico City. As we can observe in these charts, there has been a significant decrease in ozone in the last years. However, we've come to like a stagnant point where the challenge is to keep reducing ozone in the next years. And obviously, if we want to manage air quality and develop the right policies, we require the right data. Right now, in Mexico City, we actually have 29 automatic stations for criteria pollutants. 19 of them determine also meteorological parameters. And in 2013, we began intensive seasonal campaigns to gather specific data about PM chemical composition, atmospheric dynamics, and photochemistry. This year, we will be installing 4 new monitoring stations within Mexico City and 5 new black carbon monitoring stations. This is the dashboard that we have in Mexico City in real time. The mayor and I have this in our iPhone and on our tablets. So we can at any moment see how the particles are, ozone, 2.5, particles 10, and as you can see, then we also have the countability of how many clean days we have, regular UV. So this is one of the tools that we use on a daily basis to make certain decisions. In March, we're going to initiate a strategy for open government regarding air quality data and information about pollutant concentrations, meteorological conditions that will enable, and this is going to be an app for Android and iOS, where citizens will be able to see pollution levels and ultraviolet radiation from their cell phones, and the app will also offer recommendations regarding the air quality. So in conclusion, even though Mexico City is regarded as a pioneer within nationwide and in Latin America, because of the monitoring that we do on a daily basis and that we've been doing for several years, we know that we still have great challenges ahead of us. And to overcome those challenges and to have specific policies that will really enable us to come to our targets in reducing ozone and particles, PM10, 2.5, we know that we have to keep investing in monitoring, not only in the infrastructure, but in also our human resource. And that's one of the priorities that we have within this administration. We still have 5 years. So it's one of our priorities, air quality and climate change, because we're convinced that what we do for climate change will improve air quality and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Very, very impressive. I'd like to now welcome to the stage Brian Swett, the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. Brian?
Great. Thank you, Connor, and thank you for having me here. It's exciting to be here. I'm impressed with the diversity of presentations on measurement. I'm from the city of Boston, and there'll be a slightly different take. I think this will be interesting. We are relatively small. I was humbled to see sort of the stats that Mexico City puts out there. We're about 48 square miles in Boston proper. There are about 650,000 people. The metro region is about 3.5 million. But the scale is an interesting challenge that we all have as cities around how do we develop the appropriate measurement scheme, not only to assess our progress, but to be able to motivate behavior change. And I was heartened by the mayor of Dar es Salaam. I use that same tagline in almost every presentation, that what gets measured gets managed, and we can't manage what we don't measure. And that is really what we're here to talk about. So in Boston, we've been looking at and assessing our climate action since 2007. The mayor issued, my former boss, Mayor Menino, issued an executive order directing all city agencies to begin looking at what their carbon emissions were from a city perspective, and then developing community-wide protocols. Similar to most cities, I would guess, in the room, our municipally controlled emissions are only about 2.5% of our citywide emissions. So the city's buildings and services could essentially disappear, and we're don't make progress against our goal of 25% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. We have a 3-year required update to our climate action plan. We're actually in the middle of that process now. Our most recent climate action plan was issued in 2011, and we're beginning to update both our strategy, our methodologies, and then our implementation plan. We have been measuring and publicly disclosing both our municipal emissions and our community-wide emissions since 2010. And that has been a very interesting process to help drive our strategies for reducing emissions. So Boston is roughly on track. This is where we're at relative to our 25% goal and our 80% goal. We have developed largely top-down strategies for our 2020 goal, while understanding that bottom-up strategies are absolutely essential to get to our 2050 goal. And what I mean by that is we need to start taking the science talk and start taking the terminology we use and make it much more sidewalk talk. And one of the core drivers of our update this year for 2014 is making it more accessible to the average person on the street, because one of the challenges we have is when we talk to each other about emissions and about criteria pollutants and about the units of measure that we tend to use, it is not meaningful to the folks on the street. It is not meaningful to the vast majority of voters and citizens in any city around their behaviors and their everyday life challenges. So how do we make taking climate action something that everybody wants to do? And so we're approximately on track. Most of our, and it was actually similar to what you've heard from other cities, a huge portion of our emissions reduction so far has been the reduction of emissions from our electricity grid. So in New England, we've seen a large switch from coal and fuel oil being a source of our electricity generators to natural gas. There is only so much coal and fuel oil that you can take out of the electricity grid, and we're reaching that point where it's largely natural gas and nuclear now. So in terms of energy reporting and disclosure, again, it's what gets measured gets managed. We recently passed a building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance, learning from the great examples set in New York, DC, and San Francisco, and developing a policy where private sector buildings at full rollout will need to disclose their energy, water, and greenhouse gas emissions for all buildings over 35,000 square feet and 35 units of housing. And what this does is really drive home that measurement should be responsible at the point where decisions are being made. And in Boston, that's really at large buildings. So this will cover about 5 or 6% of the city's buildings, but about 40% of our square footage of buildings in the city of Boston. So even though it's only large buildings, it's a significant portion of the greenhouse gas footprint for buildings. In Boston, commercial and industrial buildings represent about 53% of our emissions, and residential buildings about 16 or 17% of our emissions. The rest is largely transportation related. And so this is critical to actually drive home changes in behavior and changes in energy use within buildings. So now everyone will have a publicly available score, and this will both elicit competition amongst buildings, but also drive the ability for the marketplace to assess and value energy efficiency as a standard of good measurement and as a standard of good management for building owners. So it's really driving home that at the building scale, we need information to help provide incentives for folks to make energy efficiency decisions. It's also invaluable for me as a policymaker for the city to understand where our low-hanging fruit is. So where are the opportunities to drive energy efficiency within the built environment? Is it 1900s era warehouses? Is it commercial buildings built in the 60s and 70s during the era of cheap energy that didn't need to build thermal envelopes and passively cool because they could buy their way out of it with mechanical ventilation? Where are the buildings that we need to focus most of our attention? So I'm very excited to see this data rolling in. The first data set from New York was over 10,000 buildings released about a year ago. That was invaluable to us to strategize. I'm excited to have Boston's buildings. At our full rollout, we're only about 2,000 buildings in this initial ordinance. So the priorities for our 2014 update, again, is one is critically is climate preparedness. We don't have the luxury anymore of saying, let's just focus on mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to both mitigate our emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change, which in Boston, everywhere is going to be heat island and increased temperatures. In Boston, we also have sea level rise and storm surge as a critical concern. We are the fourth most at risk city in the United States and 8th in the world from sea level rise and storm surge in terms of dollar value of real estate to be impacted. So in the US, we're just after Miami, New York, and New Orleans. That's not a list. There are many lists I want to be top ranking on. That's not a list I want to be top ranked on. But we know what we need to do, and we've always been a city along the water. Now it's about actually motivating action. Community engagement has been a big part of the priority for our 2014 update. And we're doing this through a variety of mechanisms using a lot of electronic media and social networking. We have a website that's up that folks should feel free to visit called engage.greeninnovateboston.org. And it is allowing us to engage with the average citizenry around what are the issues relevant to them. So is it our bike share program? Is it our recycling programs? Is it our energy efficiency programs within houses? And then developing a robust set of performance measures, and I'll spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about our next generation of performance measures. So we're trying again in the context of using terminology that is meaningful. We've bucketed our emissions in terms of at work, at home, and on the go. So these are residential emissions, commercial emissions, where you live, where you work, and how do you get from place to place. And we're trying to begin, where most cities are beginning, which is a large-scale inventory, which we've been doing since 2007, 2008, around greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Then we drive it down to one level below that, which is what are the city strategies and programs. So we have a variety of energy efficiency strategies and programs. We have mass transit programs. We have waste programs. What is the city providing both within its services and to its citizens to drive greenhouse gas emissions down? Then the level below that is how well are these programs working? So how are citizens accessing these programs? We can have the most robust incentive programs for energy efficiency in houses. If citizens aren't applying those programs and if citizens aren't using them, then we have a challenge. So it's both the existence of those programs and their utilization. And that's where we get into the community actions. So driving that down, this is an example of our at-home programs around residential solar. So we've had a program for a number of years incentivizing residential solar panels on homes and businesses, small businesses, using the context of buying in bulk. So it's the equivalent of buying something at your corner store versus going to a large store and buying in bulk. We're packaging up all of our solar power purchases on an annual basis and providing that available to residents. And we want to be able to give folks instantaneous feedback on where we're at. So this is a snapshot of the measurement program we're developing in that area for rollout later this year around residential solar. And then we want to drive home that these are really neighborhood-based solutions and that folks control our destiny as a city if we're going to reach our goals and what we're doing about it. We're using a lot of GIS technologies so that folks can look at their neighborhoods and figure out where are their solar panels on the roofs, where are their hubway stations, where are there folks that have completed energy audits, who are Greenovate ambassadors. We're actually having folks nominate themselves to help represent on these types of issues so that there are neighborhood champions, neighborhood ambassadors around climate action. Who are they? Where are they located? And then giving folks ready access to being able to sign up to our programs, energy audits, our hubway programs, and doing it in a way that you can actually see at a neighborhood scale, what do we need from each neighborhood to reach our goals, that then when you aggregate up citywide allows us to say, are we reaching 2020 goals, or are we reaching 2050 goals? So this is something new that we'll be rolling out later on this year in the context of trying to engage our average citizens around the actions that they can take. And they'll be able to see instantaneously if they sign up for an energy audit or if they had solar panels installed. They'll let us know, we'll verify it, and it goes up instantaneously. So in summary, it is about what gets measured gets managed. So we need transparency and accountability at City Hall to know that our programs are working. We need to use our measurement programs to engage the public and motivate behavior change. So we need terminology that is accessible and that folks understand and will motivate that behavior change. We need to inform the market. As folks in the room know, this information has not been readily available in the market and thus has not been evaluated in terms of energy efficiency of commercial buildings, energy efficiency of residential buildings. This is market-based information. And I have not gotten to the point of sort of requiring energy efficiency audits in Boston, or requiring energy efficiency improvements. We require the information, we require the audits, and let the market operate. And then lastly, as city officials, we need to know if our programs are working or not and hold ourselves accountable and understand how to strategize and how to improve them. So without good measurement, we can't manage what we're responsible for in City Hall in terms of being able to reach our goals 2020 and 2050 in a way that is increasing social equity, increasing economic vitality, and increasing environmental performance. And I think that's my last slide. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Brian. Very, very impressive. And I think we're going to have lots of questions for you during the audience Q&A, which is coming up. So please get your questions ready. Our next speaker is the author of this recently published book, The Guide to Greening Cities, which I encourage you to check out. He is the Deputy City Manager for the City of Vancouver, Sadhu Johnston. Sadhu?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Connor. Are we doing okay for time? Can I stick with my? Okay. Great. So thanks, everyone. And really interesting presentations and nice diversity. So thanks so much for that. I want to jump right in. This is the city of Vancouver. You can see our fair town there. We're about the size of Boston. And what I want to tell you a little bit about is how we are using our Greenest City Action Plan to move what we're doing in the city. So we've got, as you might have heard from our mayor this morning, we've got a Greenest City Action Plan that has 10 broad areas in it, from green jobs to ecological footprint to carbon and green buildings and transportation. So it's a lot to try to track, and it's a lot of projects. And so we've really struggled with how do we measure that and report it out to the public. And a lot of great lessons learned for us on that. Certainly found that the public doesn't really want to hear a bunch of technical jargon. We do need to measure our progress. We need to know how well we're doing, but we need to also find ways to package that. Now, can I go to the next slide? Okay, next one, please. So this is, we do an annual report to our city council on all of our actions, and it's a little booklet that's about 30 pages, and we try to really boil it down. You can see the table there that covers each of the 10 areas in the plan and our highest priority actions in that plan, with not just how are we doing on the action, but what's the metric that we can use to back that up. So how are we actually measuring our progress? And then on the next slide, you'll see that we then try to boil that down with simple infographics that we can get out to the public. So folks that don't want to read the whole report, they may want to know how are we doing in these key areas. So the infographics help with that, and on the next slide you can see that we then break it down to just a simple kind of environmental statement. How are we doing? Really boiling it down for folks that don't want to even get into the infographics but just want to hear the top level. So finding ways to track that is really important for us from an operational perspective, and then finding ways to report it to the public. So the next slide. The annual report includes our annual emissions on carbon, because that is one of our core areas, and it bundles up with green transportation and buildings and built environment. So we give the baseline, and then each year we give progress on how are we doing in reducing our carbon. So the city of Vancouver is, it's been a bit of a challenge for us. I think like many cities, we went all the way back to 1990. But getting really good data on 1990 emissions is really tough. I mean, it's just the standards have changed. And having CDP is absolutely critical to us now, because we can agree on what's the standard and we can do that each year. But that standard wasn't there in 1990, and so getting that data was tough for us. So we went back in our plan and really built the entire plan over our 2008 carbon emissions, because that's really easier to get a handle on. And those are about equivalent to our 1990 levels. So since 1990, our population has grown about 27%, and our jobs in the city have grown about 18%, so a lot of growth in the last 30 years, and our carbon is currently about 4% below our 1990 levels. So I think cities, many of us know, we are demonstrating that you can continue to grow, you can have a high quality of life. We've, I think, 3 of the last 5 years been rated as one of the highest quality of life in the world. So we can demonstrate that we can grow our economy, that we can continue to grow our population but reduce our carbon emissions. And so we chose 2008 as our benchmark, our baseline, and each year in our report we say how are we doing compared to that, and our target is a 2020 target is 33% reduction from that level, and each year we report on how we're doing, and the CDP gives us the framework to do that, and now the framework to benchmark against other cities. So on the next slide you'll see how we then talk about our emissions reduction targets. So then in the report, as a part of our reporting on an annual basis, we say this is where we think we're going to get those emission reductions, that some of the strategies that we're looking to pursue, which then ties in to the actions that we try to report on an annual basis. So again, we really try, it's not enough to just talk about actions, it's not enough just to talk about metrics, you got to tie the two together so people understand why you're doing what you're doing. So you can see much of this isn't just in the jurisdiction of the city. 39% of achieving our carbon targets are provincial action, fuel standards and other things that we don't necessarily control. But then in the plan you'll see we cover other areas, try to benchmark with folks. So you can see there on the next slide, this is our ecological footprint. So again, covering What are the other parts of the ways that we impact our environment? So we're trying to get to a one planet living for the city of Vancouver, and carbon is a core part of that, but there's other pieces that we need to think about. And again, much of this is we don't necessarily control, but we can implement policies that can help to move the dial on these things. So our annual report covers each of these metrics in a way that people hopefully can understand. So the next one shows you our water. And again, of course, there's connections with carbon with each of these, but carbon we do through CDP. For some of these other metrics, we really had to come up with our own standards. And so this is water use that you'll see. So that's, we do this type of reporting in each of the 10 areas that are in our plan. And we see multiple benefits if we go to the next slide. To reporting, it really helps us to take 175 projects that we're currently tracking and quantify them so we can really see how we're doing on those targets. And it's really imperative to management, as Brian, as a number of you have said already, and it ensures that actions are implemented and effective. So we know that we're not just out doing a bunch of projects. And we talked about the report that was released yesterday, 8,000 projects. Well, how much are those projects really moving the dial? We need to be able to hold ourselves accountable to know that we're making a difference. And then allows us for lessons learned. What's working? If we're doing a project and it's not moving the dial, stop, reorient, and do something that is moving the dial, and that measurement, and particularly through CDP, is helping us to do that. It also helps us to report to the public. They want to know. We talk about all these things. We do these ribbon cuttings. We do events. Is it actually working? And so on the next slide, you'll see ways that we try to boil that data down to then be able to report to the public to say, these things are actually moving the dial. We've increased biking by 180% since 1994. We've increased walking by 44%. We've increased transit ridership. We've decreased gasoline sales by 7%, and we've decreased car trips, cars entering the city. So we can then take all of that data that's kind of out there in these big reports and boil it down to people to say, yes, we are collectively making a difference. So being able to report it to the public is really important. And then the next slide, using data to drive value. So we want to talk about decision making. That data that we're gathering and this type of information can actually help us to make better decisions. You heard from the city manager here in Joburg, taking that kind of data to inform our decisions, the national policies and then our local policies. So it also helps us to eliminate some of the pet projects, the things we think are great but actually aren't having the impact we want them to have. And then, as Brian talked about, the operational influence. It allows us to do better internal decision making and choose the initiatives that we want to undertake in our own operations. And having an internal pricing of carbon, for instance, helps us to decide what types of vehicles to buy and the strategies that we might pursue. Do we renovate a building versus buy a more efficient vehicle? And what's the price of per ton of carbon for that emission? We need to have that kind of analysis for every single purchase that we make, and that's the kind of thing we can do with this type of data as we gather it. And then on the next slide, lastly, external engagement. So you do the work, you find out ways to get the data out there, but there's four kind of core components. Is the open data side. So as we gather this data, how are we actually sharing it with the community, enabling the folks that are either in Vancouver or outside to use that data to develop their own tools? And it's just amazing the types of stuff that's happening as you pump that data out rather than keeping it internal and putting our own reports out. There's amazing things that the private sector can do with it and the advocacy community. And then, of course, external influence. I talked about we need provincial action, we need federal action, so getting the data and packaging it the right way enables us to then have a consistent message externally and make a business case for the type of work that we want to do and engage other levels of government. The benchmarking piece, benchmarking internally, but also benchmarking with other cities. I mean, having CDP now, we can compare each other, which we haven't been able to do. And so you go to conferences like this, traditionally, and cities are all talking about their emissions profiles as completely different things. Now we're able to standardize that, and that's really helpful for us. And then, of course, the last piece is tying in with academia. When we have this information, we can then pull in academics to help us to really take it to the next level. So a lot of good work there. I think there are real challenges to this, I will say. You know, we've found that having a robust reporting mechanism that we do on an annual basis really holds our feet to the fire. When you don't like what the data says, it's often really hard to get it out there because people don't want to share bad news. It's an election year or whatever it is, and you haven't moved as much as you wanted to. Sometimes it's nice to delay a report. But again, working through C40 and having CDP helps us to say, well, this data is going out there whether we like it or not. And it's the same data that we issued last year. We're not changing it. So that is a challenge, I think, to be able to really hold ourselves accountable, and the data helps us to do that. Data consistency, I mean, I talked about 1990 compared to where we're at now. That's been a huge challenge. Everyone wants to say, where were you in 1990? And pulling some of that data out is really, really tough. So that's been a struggle for us, and that's why we really changed our benchmark year to be able to really hold ourselves accountable again to that period of time. So not everything can be told by data. It tells us a lot, but there's a lot of other dynamics happening that you can't get from data, and so we don't want to get stuck in it. We do want to do really robust reporting, but we got to pull out from that sometimes. So big challenges, and it's not easy. I think we all know that, which is why this kind of dialogue is really helpful. For us, just a few next steps, and the common methodologies and protocols is really critical, and that's why being part of C40 is great. Tying together the different metrics. For instance, we've struggled with, we got mode shift targets. Well, what is a mode shift? If you move 1% out of vehicles onto transit, what does that actually mean from a GHG over the next 10, 15 years? It's really hard to kind of bridge those different ways of reporting. So working on that is important. And then, of course, more robust data will help us think long term. So most of us have shorter term targets, 2020, 2030. Well, we don't want to make investments now to achieve a 2020 target that shoot ourselves in the foot for achieving a 2050 target. And so really starting to think long term is going to be important for us as well. So thank you very much, and really thanks to CDP and C40 for helping us to get on the same page as a group of cities and work together on this, and we're really excited to continue to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Sadhu. I'd like to invite all of the speakers to join me on the stage, and we're going to do a very short panel discussion here. If you're in the audience and you have questions for some of these fantastic folks, please think of them now, and we're gonna get to them in just a minute. I'd like to ask the panelists just to start off with just one question from me. For each of you, and maybe if you just give a very short answer, and then we'll go to the audience for a couple of questions. But give us your sort of top 2 tips on how to build a culture of data and measurement in your city. How do you inculcate that in all of your staff? And are there any tips that you have for us? And maybe Sadhu, if you wouldn't mind starting just at the end, and then we can just pass the microphone down.
Well, I think is this working? Can you hear me back there? Well, one thing for us is our council, when they adopted the Greenest City Action Plan, told us to do an annual report back to them. And so that really holds us, the staff, accountable. We can't push it off. We can't make excuses that we haven't been able to find the right data. So that's one thing that just, again, holds us accountable as staff to report to our council. So that would be one tip that's been really helpful. And then I think the other piece is tying the data that you're gathering back into the budget process. So many times I feel like you got the budget office and they're doing a capital plan that's maybe a 10-year plan, a 3-year plan, and then a 1-year plan, and then you got all the carbon reporting and all of that work happening on the other side. And as I talked about, our internal cost of carbon, for instance, really helps us to bridge back to the decisions that we make from an investment perspective. So I think really tying that reporting back into our own performance management measurement as an organization, not letting the carbon piece happen off to the side, but really tying it in particularly into the budget process.
That's great. Thanks, Sadhu. Brian?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with those 2. I would add 2 others. One is choose your terminology carefully in the sense of make it meaningful to your citizens, to who we are accountable to. And that is both from the types of measures and then how do we convey progress. So a ton of greenhouse gas emissions means almost nothing to anyone. You need to convey it in terms of houses off the grid, cars not driving each year. What are some meaningful measures so that folks can understand progress? The second one is, in most of these cities, we're all evaluating our emissions on an annual basis. We want to get contextual measures to explain progress, because any given year, any 2 data points is not a trend. And you want to understand, we talked a lot about growth, about population growth, economic activity. How do we explain our progress or challenges to our progress over time? And being able to collect those measures is really important to tell your story. You always want to be able to tell your story before others, including the press, will tell it for you, because you will probably tell it more accurately than someone else who's less familiar.
Thank you. In Johannesburg and in South Africa, there is a very strict statutory reporting requirements to council and to the public, which is voluminous. And one of the key challenges is to really get staff to break that down into simple things that people can understand so that it can be tracked, so very similar to the points that you're making. But the second is really to measure the right things, because what we tend to measure are the things that go in, not what's coming out at the other end. And so key question is, if you're measuring the difference in greenhouse gas emissions, you must measure what the actual emission is. So if you, as in our case, we've reduced electricity consumption, real consumption, by 2.5% over the last 4 or 5 years, despite 20,000 people coming into the city every month. The point is that results in a 5% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, thank you. Mr. Mayor?
Thank you very much. In Dar es Salaam, the city is actually coordinating the affairs of the municipalities. So when we were trying to see how we could remove the slum people from the slum area to upgrade their lives, what we did is to organize committees at grassroots level. So what we do is to make sure that we go through the mid-term expenditure framework, where we ask the people at the bottom, at the lower level government, that what they want to achieve. Then we think of the vulnerability, like health problems that are involved in the slum areas, and then we see how we can reduce those problems. So after getting the objective on whether to reduce malaria, for example, which is vulnerable, which affect the vulnerable community, then we check the number of the people who are affected per annum. And then we see how we can reduce that number through improvement of the infrastructure. Now, after putting down the objectives, and then we break them into activities, after that, what is next is to see what kind of inputs, that is resources, human resource, financial resources, technical, and the like. After that, we measure these, we put the measuring units, the unit of measure for each item that are needed as inputs, so that we can know what the level of effort that will be put to achieve the objectives. Now, at the end of the day, we check our progress, the progress done as compared to the objectives and targets that we were targeting for the first day. In that matter, we can now measure the level of progress and report back to the community and to the municipalities as well. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions for our panel? Yes, right here in the second row. Please just tell us your name and then state your question quickly. We've just got about 5 minutes, so let's try to get as many questions as we can.
My name is Elise Tempelhof. I'm a South African, and my question is to Mr. Fowler. I know that City of Johannesburg has lots of challenges. Recently we had floods. And I just want to find out whether there is a budget for climate damage, and how big is that budget?
Great. Mr. Fowler, yeah.
Thank you. There's certainly a budget to ensure that when there are things such as floods, that we are able to take the kind of measures that are necessary, first of all, to address whatever actions are required in relation to evacuating people if necessary, or ensuring that the measures are taken if it's as a result of blockages or storm drain blockages, that those are then dealt with. So those kinds of issues are being addressed. But when I suspect what you're asking is whether there's a budget to compensate people for the damage. That would be a private matter that would occur. Yeah. Yes, from an infrastructure point of view, one of the things we're doing is we're ramping up the expenditure, some 100 billion over the next over 10 years, to ensure that we refurbish old infrastructure and address and replace some of the older infrastructure, so that it becomes, we are more resilient in addressing the impact of climate change.
That's great, thank you. Next question, please. I think that's Krista. Yeah, hi.
Hi, Krista from the City of Melbourne, Australia. We heard a lot in the mayoral discussions around climate plans are often plans for livability, economic resilience plans for cities. I guess I'm interested in how we, as cities, transition our reporting into actually reporting the value of these climate strategies in a jobs growth, economic benefit, and whether any of the cities that are on the stage have started to do that, and any progress, and also, I guess, a question related to the CDP report in that aspect.
That's a great question. So I know Sadhu and Brian, you both mentioned integrating jobs and focusing on jobs. I don't know, Sadhu, maybe if you want to just start us off, and Brian and anyone else who wants to chip in, but talk to us about that integration, between climate and the more real world issues.
Sure. So as a part of our plan, as I mentioned, there's 10 components. One of the components is green jobs, and that's cross-cutting across all of the other 9 areas, because waste and many of these things produce jobs. And so that area has two specific targets in it, and so we report back on an annual basis on those targets, and it's how many jobs in the city have we greened is one target, and the second is how many green jobs have we helped to create. And so we try to track both of those. And that's, again, another, from a data perspective, been a real challenge. There's no common definition from city to city on what is a green job. So we kind of had to cobble together our own definition based on something that the UN had. So it's really hard to kind of benchmark across. And it's also hard to gather that data. So we have to do a survey from our Economic Development Agency on an annual basis. And so that's very cumbersome and difficult to report, but we do try to report out on it and to try to track it. And then obviously on just savings, we always try to tell kind of the economic side of the story. So if we've done energy retrofits, how many jobs were created, or growing food, how many jobs are created in that area. So just trying to tie the two together. So it's not just hey, we're growing more food locally, and that's created X number of jobs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's certainly a challenge around green jobs as meaning different things in different cities. So we report on green jobs as well. So that's a huge economic driver for our actions. I would add, the quality of life indicators in general are something that you want to tie to it. So one that's been big in the United States is access to open space and distance to it. So 95% of Bostonians live within a quarter-mile walk of a public park or playground. And we set targets around making sure that there are diverse uses, both active and passive. So I think you want to communicate metrics, not just economic drivers and value drivers, but metrics that matter to the average citizen. We're also very proactive in reporting our financial savings as a municipality, not from our work, not only because it's the tax dollars at the end of the day, it's citizens' money that we want to make sure is used most effectively, but it also sets an example for the private sector. So when we're out there saying that our LED streetlight retrofit program is already saving $3 million a year of taxpayer dollars, it makes folks who also own parking lots and parking garages say, well, wait a second, that's a compelling number to me. I can start to think about that in real terms, and here's what the payback period was. And so we use the transparency around our own energy programs to really motivate behavior in the private sector.
That's great. Mr. City Manager?
Yes, we have a set of priorities, key priorities that we focus on. We have 10 of them, and one of them is about the green economy. So it's a fairly recent priority that we've put in place, but it does, will attempt to measure both jobs and the growth of output in terms of value of the green economy. But some of the key decisions we've taken is we purchased buses recently, and instead of having the buses imported, we require that they're manufactured here, and we're also doing dual fuel buses to ensure that and try to get them manufactured locally so that you create green jobs.
That's great. Mr. Meyer?
Thank you. In Dar es Salaam, we have also the green economy strategy. We are trying to work at grassroots level to make sure that the community are the beneficiaries. So what they do is to first compost all waste which are coming from the market, which can be composted and therefore will produce some fertilizers, which will then be used by the city gardeners, those who are making gardens, and also the urban farming, where these people will use the fertilizers for growing vegetables and some sort of other small crops in the city. So by introducing that regulatory framework, most of the youths in the city who are not employed now can be employed in the composting areas, in the composting sites. And then they will now get jobs which will create wealth to themselves. But at the same time, this will also promote farming in the urban areas. So, people will use the same fertilizer and therefore will create some other jobs to the people who are going to sell those goods to the markets. In the BRT, we are expecting that upon completion, we shall create about 80,000 jobs in the city, which are not directly related to the running of the buses. But that will depend on, for example, cleaning the buses, where we are going to employ some of the youth, self-employed groups, to use the technology which are also green. And we are also going to make sure that the buses that are coming will also be friendly to the impact of the climate. That is, the fuel that will be used must be compatible with the climate change environment. So these are some few examples that we do in Dar es Salaam.
That's great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of your questions, but can I please encourage you to come up and talk to the panelists afterwards? There's a tremendous amount of knowledge, as you've seen on this panel, so please make use of it and ask them your questions individually. Thank you for being a great audience, and please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers and panelists for the Measurement and Planning Network session today. Thank you, everybody.